Good evening, everyone. My name is Katira Noviello Kapoor, and I am the Senior Director of Health Promotion, Wellness, and Athletics at the 92nd Street Y. Thank you so much for joining this Spark Your Health talk this evening, a very special talk. We are joined by Dr. Peter Kramer and Dr. Gail Saltz to talk about the really infamous book, there we go. Listening to Prozac, and this is the 30-year anniversary and the 30-year re-release with a new introduction of that very book. So I think we're in for a very informative and exciting discussion. We have many more Spark Your Health events coming up in the near future. I'll be putting those into the chat throughout the event, so feel free to take a look at those. As far as Q&A goes, we will make sure that we have plenty of time at the end of the event for the Q&A. So feel free to be typing any questions you have into the chat throughout the duration of the event, and we will make sure we get to those. So so pleased to be joined here by Dr. Gail Saltz. Gail Saltz is a clinical associate professor of psychiatry at the New York Presbyterian Hospital, the author of 6 books, including The Power of Different, The Link Between Disorder and Genius, and iHeartMedia podcast host. Dr. Saltz, thank you so much for being with us this evening.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for that introduction. And I have the pleasure and really the honor of introducing Peter D. Kramer, who is a psychiatrist and emeritus professor of psychiatry at Brown University. He's the author of 8 books, including Against Depression, Ordinarily Well, The Case for Antidepressants, and most recently, Death of the Great Man, a novel about a psychiatrist's effort to treat a buffoonish, autocratic national leader. His groundbreaking book, Listening to Prozac, is an international bestseller, and it's now available in its 30th anniversary edition with a new introduction and afterword with updates by the author. Peter also serves on the Group for the Advancement of Psychiatry committee with me in communications, which is how we came to know one another. And I am delighted to have you with us tonight, Peter.
Thank you. So this is an example of what we've been working on together a little, which is trying to make psychiatry understandable and to say why it's important.
Absolutely. And in that vein, I wonder if you can tell us, so 30 years ago, you were in private practice in Providence, Rhode Island, and you were on the faculty of Brown. What motivated you to write the book, Listening to Prozac, in the first place?
So I'm going to go back further to a story of romance. I was in my residency at Yale and met Rachel, who subsequently I've been married to for 40 plus years, and decided I wanted to be with her. And she was in Washington. I was going to go down there. And I worked with my residency director, and he said that I could work in the federal government if I did extra work for half a year for the program, be supervised in the federal government and work on a program in community psychiatry. So I was very interested in psychotherapy and in bringing services to the underserved. So I arranged to do that for half a year. And before I arrived, that program for community psychiatry was canceled. And I was assigned to be effectively an assistant to the head of the agency that oversaw NIH and some of the other agencies dealing with mental health. And I was asked to master the whole federal research portfolio, to basically know every grant in the sciences in mental health and drug abuse that the federal government gave money to, and to translate scientific findings for senators and so on, and to translate Jimmy Carter's government policy for research directors. And then a few years later, as you say, I was in Providence in private practice. So that time in Washington exposed me to an enormous biological research portfolio, which I'd known nothing about, and to the scientists who did the research. And I was in practice when Prozac was introduced, and I was taking notes, as I always did. I kept process notes for what was mostly psychotherapy. I did do some prescribing, and I had a separate page for the medication and what patients' responses were. And I noticed that the medication pages were starting to look a lot like the psychotherapy pages. There were patients saying that the medicines, these new medicines, had revealed to them something about who they were, that they'd had psychological responses, they were more confident, less neurotic, that the medicines were doing things that we expect psychotherapy to do. And I thought, I can write about this. I'd already written another book. I was interested in being a writer. I thought that I had a sense of what the science was that was behind these apparent personality effects of the new antidepressants. This, by way of background, Prozac and later Zoloft had just been introduced. So that was how I came to think about writing the book.
I remember when it came out so well. I was at the beginning of my career, and it was so mind-bogglingly revolutionary, and both professionals and everybody in the public was really riveted. I mean, that was the cover of magazines, and it was just, that year was sort of the year of that book and that information. But over the past 30 years, in retrospect, how do you think the book influenced the field in a way? And how do you think it influenced how people have viewed things like medication and illness?
Yeah, I think it had a number of effects, and it's hard to say this without, taking credit for things that are not fully due to the book, certainly to me. But I think before the introduction of Prozac, doctors were fairly reluctant to prescribe, especially for patients with lesser degrees of mental illness. And it was an era when Americans were just barely becoming comfortable with discussing depression, being aware of depression, discussing mental illness. William Styron's Darkness Visible was a big influence, but came out just before listening to Prozac. So that there was a series of books that really decreased the stigma in talking about depression. I think the book was part of a move in the field more toward a medical model. If you had a medicine that can really affect depression, it puts some of the psychological causes a little bit in the background, makes them share space with some of the more biological causes. I think there was an upsurge of interest in medical ethics, this question of what can doctors do that goes beyond treating acute illness? If you could make people more confident who were shyer, say, is that a legitimate medical undertaking, or is that something that doctors should stay away from? So I think there were a number of influences. I wrote the book because I was very interested in this question of how medication affects personality. But I would say the book had another public role. It was taken to be a book about depression, really about major depression, which is not discussed all that much in the book at all. As I traveled the country, I was aware that I'd sort of opened a door to people discussing depression and looking for solutions that went beyond psychotherapy.
So it has been 30 years, and in many other areas of medicine, there have been just dramatic changes. You look at many other medical illnesses, dramatic changes on the way things are treated, the number of medications that are available. What do you think? Here you are updating the book. What do you think has changed in the last 30 years, really, in terms of medications, psychotherapy, and in terms of diagnosis and treatment in general?
Well, depression, and maybe this is broader in psychiatry, has been a disappointing area for research. We always feel we're on the verge of change, and I would say now we really feel that we're on the verge of change, that there are going to be new treatments. But, over the past 30 years, our ability to treat depression has not improved all that much. And Prozac, speaking strictly in terms of efficacy, that is, how many people get better, is not all that much of an improvement over some of the early antidepressants, which were developed starting in the late 1950s. However, doctors were much more comfortable giving Prozac. It was easier to dose than the older medicines, had fewer acute side effects, and enormous changes that were treating much more depression. So when Prozac was introduced, probably about 2 Americans in 100 were on an antidepressant, and now the number is up to 1 in 7, 1 in 8. I mean, we're talking 13, 14, 15% of the population may have taken an antidepressant in a year. Now, we can discuss whether that's good or bad, but certainly included in there is some greater willingness to treat depression altogether.
Well, actually, that was sort of leads me to the, is it good? Is it bad? Are we undertreating? Are we overtreating? Which also brings up the question, as you move through that, who is treating mental illness today, which I think has greatly changed in the last 30 years. So maybe you can address those issues.
Yeah, you're sort of leading the witness, but in the Carter administration, in public health, which is where I was, we were really looking to interest primary care doctors in the treatment of depression. And I think Prozac really turned that switch. Primary care doctors were very reluctant to prescribe the older antidepressants because you had to raise the dose slowly. There were very bad side effects that, would send people to emergency room. They were easier to commit suicide on. And so, now the majority of antidepressant prescribing is done by non-psychiatrists, by internists, obstetricians, kind of goes across the board. People feel fairly adept at taking that first step. Psychiatry was a little bit resistant to that, actually. They felt that anyone being treated for a mental illness should first be evaluated by a psychiatrist, but that's pretty much gone by the boards. And I think we are comfortable with having some of the initial treatment done by non-psychiatrists. A lot of depressed people never get one adequate treatment. About a third of people with depression have never had, even a brief course of psychotherapy, have never had even a few weeks of medication. It's still true that probably the modal number of prescriptions for someone with depression is one prescription. They're given a prescription and not given any follow-up. So, there certainly is some underprescribing. It's also true, and we can kind of discuss how much of this is good and how much is bad, that much lower levels of illness are being prescribed for. And maybe there's just some inaccuracy. People who don't have a condition that would respond to an antidepressant are getting antidepressants.
So I take that to mean, I agree with this. I take that to mean there are people perhaps who would otherwise not get any treatment if they were not, for example, prescribed by their primary care physician or their gynecologist. And that would be a problem. And still, there isn't enough access, and there's still people who aren't getting treatment. But there are also people who are probably being prescribed for when maybe they shouldn't be. Maybe really what they should be being offered, for example, is psychotherapy. Maybe they don't have major depression, clinical depression. They have something else going on, essentially, and would benefit from addressing that, whatever that is. And then, of course, there's the issue of, a primary care physician doesn't do a psychiatric evaluation. They do their evaluation, which is different. And then they don't have follow-up, 2 weeks later, 4 weeks later to see, if the person is okay on this med, is this med working for them? Do we want to try a different med? All of those things. Can you further share thoughts on,
Yeah, so let me give some yes buts to that.
Yes.
And I really discussed the appropriateness of prescribing in my prior nonfiction book, Ordinarily Well. And there was a study where people went door to door in Baltimore, poor neighborhoods, and asked people if they were on antidepressants, and if they were, effectively did a quick re-diagnosis right at the doorstep. And it turned out that there were very few pretty healthy people on antidepressants. It might be that those patients primarily had depression. It might be they were anxious, whatever it was. But being on an antidepressant was pretty much a marker for some severity of illness. And in my own practice, I found that when internists or family doctors referred a patient to me, I might not think they were necessarily on the right medicine. I might want to alter something, but I never thought, well, why is this patient being sent to me? There's really nothing wrong with him or her. Usually there was some level of severity.
Well, then let's talk about, so there's sort of been, I feel like this resurges every few years. Someone pops up to say, well, I've done a study And I have doubts about the efficacy of antidepressants
Right.
in general.
Yeah.
And I, the sort of the latest hoo-ha was about, well, they don't really affect serotonin.
Right.
And we've been saying that the whole model about depression is about serotonin, which is also, frankly, up for grabs now as well. But those are the kinds of statements being made. So what does the current data say really about antidepressants?
So this question about serotonin, I really discuss in detail at length, I hope understandably, in the new introduction and the new afterword to Listening to Prozac. The introduction is largely about cultural effects, but the cultural effects include anti-psychiatry, attacks on psychiatry, and then I use the afterword to update the science. So in Listening to Prozac, I say that this theory about serotonin and similar transmitters causing depression is at least incomplete and probably mistaken. So we really, and that was not original to me. The field understood there were problems with that theory 30 years ago, and really, and ordinarily well, I trace the field's ambivalence about those theories back into the 1960s. So really, almost as soon as there were antidepressants, there was uncertainty about what role serotonin and norepinephrine were playing. That said, the other thing I write about in the afterwards is there's lots of interesting research right now on serotonin, tying it to depression, but even more tying it to these personality changes. That is, if we were to say, psychologically, what is serotonin linked to? It's linked to things like dominance hierarchy in animals. So the lobster near the food source is going to be a high serotonin lobster. We urinate and put Prozac into the water, and fish get it, worms get it, birds get it, and they have behavioral effects. And the behavioral effects are largely toward, shortcutting niceties and behaving more boldly, which is good or bad depending on the species. So I think the connection between serotonin and confidence and leadership and that kind of thing is less ambiguous than it was when I wrote, interestingly, less in dispute than when I wrote Listening to Prozac. There's some interesting new research on antidepressants and how they affect depression. And some of those leave out serotonin, that there's some fairly direct medication effects that Prozac may attach to receptors in the brain fairly directly in a way that doesn't require serotonin and affect depression in that way. I've shortcut another question, which is, do antidepressants work? Yes, they work. There's lots of evidence that they work. There's lots of bad debunking evidence that really is sort of, I call it zombie research, where the same failed studies show up again and again, saying that antidepressants don't work. They work. They work in, these very obvious instances where you give someone an anti-cancer drug that can cause depression, and if you give an antidepressant first, the anti-cancer drug doesn't cause depression, and that's in sort of unselected populations, right? We're not having to diagnose people with depression to give them the anti-cancer drug. They're being given it for another reason. This is a long discussion. We can go on with it, but let me stop at that point.
Well, I guess to follow from that, so one of the big concepts, as you brought up earlier in Listening to Prozac in the original, is this better than well. So it was ethically very controversial in terms of the idea, like, are we trying to make designer people? Right. Are we trying to say, no, it's not good to be introverted. Everybody should be an extrovert. Everybody should be, these are the things that make you better in life, or that everybody would aspire to be. So if we can do it with drugs, we should do it. And other people saying, no, that's wrong. And of course, since that time, books like Quiet have come out, that we have a very different understanding, perhaps, of what it means to be an introvert or an extrovert, or the difference between introversion and social anxiety, the difference between, confidence, or how much confidence you have in social anxiety. But your book first brought this idea of like medicating things that we don't necessarily call a psychiatric illness. So where are you on that today? Where's the
Right.
data
So,
on that today?
I want to say, listening to Prozac, if you read it again in the new edition, it poses that question, right? I think there's a sense that these books about quiet and there are a number of other ones that are sort of against happiness, presume that listening to Prozac is sort of cheerleading this movement, where in fact it's worrying about it. The LA Times said the book could have been called Worrying About Prozac when the book first came out. And I think that's right. I was saying that in particular, it looked as if the new antidepressants could be used to push women in a certain direction. Should women be more assertive? Is sort of traditional Victorian femininity something that we're want to put on the siding in favor of women who are good corporate executives and so on. And that is the subject matter of the book. And but it came to me for clinical reasons. I mean, this book is entirely out of clinical practice, so that I had patients in the first instance say to me, on this medicine, I'm myself at last. And I said, well, right, would you never have been yourself if this medicine hadn't been invented? How are we defining the self through medication responses? And also I had patients who did well on the medicine. In those days, we kept patients on antidepressants 6 to 9 months, a year at the outside, would try taking them off. And so a patient would come off medication, not necessarily be depressed again, but come in and say, I did better with my children on medicine, or I have a job interview coming up. I found I was a little more responsive, quicker, more assertive on medication. And that was really where those ethical questions came up. They came up in entirely practical terms with particular patients.
Was there data at the time, or is there data now that really addresses what personality changes are routinely seen? And of course, now there aren't just SSRIs anymore. There are SNRIs. There are other classes of antidepressants. And how do those fit in with the better than well concept?
Right. So, I had really two catchphrases in the book. One was better than well, which was people who had an ailment, largely depression, who said, I haven't just recovered from that episode, I'm better in some way socially. And cosmetic psychopharmacology was, by analogy with cosmetic surgery, using these medicines in a way that would take people from a normal but less desired social state to a normal but more desired one. And there, shortly after listening to Prozac, there was a flurry of research on these lines. And it looked as if when you gave normal people without a family history of depression and so on, the SSRIs, medicines like Prozac, they did show more leadership traits. And the leadership included collaboration. And I think that probably is a change from 30 years ago to now, is our notion of what assertiveness looks like and what alpha status and a hierarchy looks like includes collaboration. It's really not just violence.
So we're talking about assertiveness, not aggression.
Yeah, we're talking about true leadership traits for a monkey or a mouse or whatever it is we're doing the research on, but it looks like it happens in people as well.
So we know that medication impacts the brain in certain ways, although we're in reality, from a neuroscience perspective, we're not even too certain what those ways are at this juncture. At a really, at a molecular level, we're really not. But let's turn to psychotherapy. I'm a psychiatrist. I'm also a psychoanalyst. And pretty uniformly, when you're talking about psychiatric illness like clinical major depression, most studies seem to show that it's the combination of medication plus psychotherapy that definitely outperforms either one independently for moderate to severe clinical major depression. So what is the listening to Prozac version of of
So
psychotherapy?
in listening to Prozac, I say that almost all the patients are in psychotherapy. That was what my practice was. I said that thing about being interested in community psychiatry and psychotherapy as a way of saying this was not a book written by a dedicated medicator, but what's I think listening to Prozac, Against Depression, and Ordinary Well are really a trilogy, and they follow along an idea. And the idea in its most current form is that one thing that antidepressants do is make the brain more resilient, and sometimes in dramatic ways. So there are studies where you give patients antidepressants and they're able to develop perfect pitch in a way that normally you can only develop in infancy, and that there are patients who have amblyopia. They have the brain is attending less to one eye than the other, and you give them Prozac, and you put a patch over the highly functional eye, and you get back some ability to get bifocal vision. So again, you're putting the brain into a more flexible infantile state. And I think the most current theories, and I've spent a lot of time in that afterwards writing about this, about antidepressants, is one thing they do is make the brain more able to learn a certain way. And I think that may be why the combination of medication and psychotherapy is so powerful, is that you kind of end a roadblock, restore flexibility to the brain, and then you can learn. But what's interesting about the contemporary theory is also how much of that is built into the pill. Because if you think a little, and this is too complicated, you'll have to read about it, but if you think a little about what I said earlier, which is that serotonin makes people sort of less neurotic, better able to view the self in a favorable light. And the other aspects of the antidepressant maybe are working on these roadblocks and making learning better. You have a medicine that both makes it easier to learn and gives you a more favorable perspective. So that maybe these medicines are working through a sort of built-in combination of, getting rid of a stuck switch problem and allowing for a more favorable sort of learning. So anyway, that, as I say, that's a little much all at once, but I certainly agree with you. Ideally, if I were depressed, I would want some, seriously enough that I would want to be on medication. I would also want psychotherapy.
So, which, has made the current state, particularly today, where there are so many people in need and not enough providers, has made it exceptionally difficult, because of course your primary care physician or your gynecologist is not going to also provide you psychotherapy. But it's,
although I don't want to undersell primary care doctors. There was a study I did 1,000,000 years ago about therapeutic listening, how much time doctors spent listening. Our doctors, sadly, primary care doctors have less and less time per patient, but really they very largely with these patients where they were able to recognize some level of illness did spend some time talking to the patients. So I am largely, the contacts I had with my non-psychiatrist colleagues was pretty impressed with them.
And I think to your point, people don't often think about the idea that psychotherapy is really teaching you something. It's teaching you the skills. So when you are too ill to learn, when you're too cognitively impaired by your illness to learn, we are sort of stuck in the psychotherapy until perhaps medication makes you, as you're, a little bit more well. And as you're bringing up, it helps you to be able to learn those skills that we're teaching in psychotherapy.
We haven't talked about what depression is, but depressed people often can only think that they're worthless, they're horrible, life is hopeless, and it's very hard to use that as a starting point for progress. And I think that if a medication can give a little change in perspective, often that's something a psychotherapist can work with to amplify that. So it's
other medications.
Yeah.
You know, even though I agree with you that we haven't made as much progress perhaps in the past 30 years to have, you know, we've still got a lot of medications that basically are shooting a cannonball at a fly, you know, that affect a whole system of neurotransmitters, because that is what we've got now. So, you know, there are some that affect serotonin more, some norepinephrine, some dopamine, some GABA. But, you know, the book was listening to Prozac because you saw this real change. And because, as you pointed out, Prozac had fewer side effects than the tricyclic antidepressants, which were the next best thing we had at that point in time.
Yes.
What about some of the other medications? And
well, I think we're at a really interesting moment. You know, we're looking at psychedelics, we're looking at ketamine, and those are not well studied. I have I mentioned a funny study in the book. Ketamine was an anesthetic before it was used for depression. And somebody thought to do a study where they took depressed patients who needed surgery, say for a bad broken leg, and they would either give them ketamine in the dose, in an antidepressant dose, and then if more anesthetic was needed, use a conventional anesthetic, or they would just give them a conventional anesthetic. And when those patients came out of anesthesia, the ones who would give a ketamine were no less or more depressed. Everybody was actually somewhat less depressed, and there may be some antidepressant effects in other anesthetics as well. But, you know, ketamine is, we have lots of hopes for ketamine, but it's not, if you have doubts about whether Prozac works, you're really going to have doubts about whether ketamine works. And I think in popular culture, it's the other way. We're sort of tired of Prozac. Anybody who can benefit has been on it, and people are very excited about ketamine. There's also a drug that just came out that has affects hormones that are related to hormones that change during pregnancy in women, and that looks very promising. It's a medicine that is either given intravenously over a long period of time, a day and a half really, or given for a couple of weeks, and then you're off it. And patients seem to do well for 6 or 9 months until they need another go round. It's expensive. You know, we don't know what the cost issues are going to be, but I think, you know, we have a number of promising maps ahead. Now, we haven't discussed negative effects. And I think one of the negative effects that's gotten a lot of press is whether it's very hard to get off antidepressants if you've been on them for a long time. Of course, none of that's in listening to Prozac, because very few people were on antidepressants for a long time, and they certainly hadn't been on Prozac for a long time because it had just been introduced. And I think it will be interesting with these medicines like ketamine, like some of the hormone-based medicines that you only give for a short period of time and then stop. It will be interesting whether down the road we see effects similar to those that people attribute to withdrawal, you know, or not, because it's very hard to withdraw from a medicine that you're just given for 2 weeks and then you're off for 6 or 9 months.
Yeah, I agree with you that I think we talk too little publicly about the reality, which is that for some people more than others, but for a good chunk of people, getting off the medication is really, really difficult, especially with some of the newest or newer antidepressants, and that we don't talk about tapering perhaps at an extremely slow rate, which, you know, is cumbersome, and nobody wants to have to do it, but it may be the only way to do it without a lot of suffering, which
you know,
not in the first place.
Oddly, I wrote some about this in Against Depression. You know, there was this perturbation theory, which was to get rid of depression, you had to perturb the brain fairly substantially. And I always wanted not to perturb the brain as I got patients off. This is metaphorical talk, but, you know, as I got patients off antidepressants. So we would taper very slowly. And, you know, depression to some extent goes with latitude. And I'm practicing in Providence, which is in New England. And I would sort of aim to have people off medication if I could, you know, around April, May, June, when the days were long. So we would start 9 months before or 21 months before. I
Mhm.
mean, we would have a long horizon. And most of the studies of tapering, were tapering over a month. So
Right.
it's not the same
And in fact, a
thing. And
lot of
parenthetically,
practitioners,
I did not see a lot of bad withdrawal. People said, I feel like I have a cold for a few days. I feel miserable. I don't want to go through that again. But these long lasting after effects of coming off antidepressants, either I was just blind to them or I was doing something different with my patients.
hmm,
They were not a big part of my practice.
I've seen many patients that really, we had to go back and really required like 10% decrease.
Yeah,
And the way these drugs are produced, that's very difficult to do. That's the other problem.
yeah,
They're not made in these strengths that allow you to do that at
right.
that slow rate. And so as a consequence, I think part of the bad rap, I guess I'll say, that antidepressants continue to get
Mhm.
is people who are afraid to go on it because they're
Right.
afraid of how will they and how difficult will it be to get off of it. Um,
No, and I think that's good in a way. I think we should have patients worry on the way in and be able to talk to them about what the risks are, and people can make informed decisions. I mean, depression is hard in the informed consent arena, as are some of the other mental illnesses, because the perspective can be so hopeless to start with. But yes, I think it's not bad for people to worry on the way in.
well, I think I'm going to ask you also to weigh in a little bit about the DSM-5 because it's, it's the only tool we have right now to talk about a diagnosis, to sort of say something that we might think to each other as clinicians, to say something to an insurance company so that the patient can get reimbursed, and to think about perhaps prognosis or the collection of symptoms we're seeing. But it's far from ideal, and yet we don't seem to be moving in any other direction.
Right. So I thought about writing a book. I actually proposed writing a book that I then did not write as DSM-5 was coming out about the nature of diagnosis. And I didn't write it because so much smart stuff has been written about diagnosis. And one of the smart things has to do with how much of a natural kind a diagnosis is. So, on an alien planet, carbon will still have an atomic number of 12. And it isn't true that on an alien planet, everyone will know what anorexia nervosa is. It's not a kind in that way. And I think, in human history, things like schizophrenia, manic depression, serious depression are pretty broadly cross-cultural. I think they're really recognized. And, other things like anorexia nervosa, I think sometimes came under the auspices of religion and sometimes, and are more subject to fads and contagion. So, I mean, not to pick that out, but I think there are diagnoses in DSM-5 that are pretty much part of certainly Western cultural history, and others that are not. And I think that most psychiatrists think that depression will be very multiple, that there'll be all kinds of depression with complicated genetic bases and so on. I am sort of a laggard. I like the diagnosis depression. And I think that it may turn out that they're kind of biological bottlenecks, that there are things that are really held in common by a lot of these depressive diagnoses, whether you get them from having problems with your thyroid or you get them through having been abused in childhood. I don't think that depression is going to dissipate and be as diverse as, but I will say I have many colleagues who do think it will. And the example, is the genetics of autism and the genetics of schizophrenia, which have been looked into a lot. And those do look very diverse. It looks like there are lots of ways to injure people's ability to have empathy, relate socially, use language fluently in the case of autism. And that is going to turn out to be very multiple, maybe in its form as well as in its causes. And I don't know that that's going to be as true of depression, but that's, many people don't agree with me who are many very smart people don't agree with me about that.
There's a division.
I don't dislike DSM-5 either. I think we need a way of talking to each other. We need a way of billing insurance companies. We need a way of making patients feel they have things in common with other people. And the fact that it is, largely observational, that's just where we are now. We hope to do better. We hope for what psychiatrists call biological markers. You'd like to have a blood test or a response to a chemical stimulus or something that tells you which disorder you have. But we have some of that, but not fairly little.
Well, of course, I know you don't have a crystal ball, but do you have thoughts about where you see the field heading? I mean, are you saying you see the field moving in a much more biologic direction?
I do. I mean, I am a great fan of psychotherapy. I spent most of my clinical hours practicing psychotherapy. My third book, Should You Leave, which is about intimacy, is also largely about odd psychotherapies that I liked and collected. And I think psychotherapies change with the times. I think that the older psychotherapies, the odd ones that probably were prevalent in the 1960s and 70s, were probably as effective as the ones we're using now. I'm not, raising my hand in enthusiasm for CBT or DBT. I think that as the culture changes, psychotherapies change. But I'm not like Freud, where I think you're going to discover, that sexual repression is at the bottom of all illnesses and you can cure it. And so this is better than some other psychotherapy. I think with medication, we do seem better staged with the ability to do gene sequencing, with computers, with AI. It's kind of hard to believe that we're not going to do better in the next 30 years than we've done in the past 30. And I'd love to be around writing another introduction and afterwards in 10 years. And I think if on this, in this meeting, I'll put down my marker and say, we will be doing better in 10 years than we're doing now.
Bring you back to say that. All right, I want to make sure to get to some audience questions. First, what is your feeling about the new frontier of psychedelic therapeutics? Ketamine's efficacy for treating depression and anxiety, the promising clinical trials for psilocybin, also for depression and addiction, and MDMA for PTSD.
Yeah, I have very little to say about it because most of what I write about, have written about over my career is from my clinical experience. I have no clinical experience. I think that the research is more preliminary than people imagine. A lot of these studies attract people who've already done well on psychedelics, so it's sort of a pre-preferential group. They're going to prefer the psychedelic to the placebo. However, I think it's very promising. I think it's very interesting. It certainly goes along with this perturbation theory of interrupting depression, that if you really give the brain a good shake, maybe that sort of resets the system. Also, and this is in the new afterwards, these psychedelics and ketamine do a terrific job at this resiliency business. They really bind to something called TrkB, which we won't get into, but they bind to something that seems to make the brain do better with a particular chemical that allows it to make new connections between nerve cells and grow new nerve cells. So the psychedelics look very promising on that front.
Are the studies of effects of SSRIs based only on patient self-reporting or also on feedback from those interacting with patients? In other words, are patients' perceptions validated by others?
Yes, so ordinarily well is about this question, like how do we measure depression? How do doctors observe depression? And, of course, I would say the big problem in drug evaluation is drug company involvement. And the second big problem is that a lot of people who, most patients who enter studies of drugs are people who haven't done well on available drugs, because, you know, for a few cents a day, you can be on an antidepressant. Internists are willing to prescribe them, so that by the time someone gets to a drug study, that person has failed multiple trials and is someone who probably doesn't respond to a lot of the conventional treatments. That said, doctor observation is a very important part of the evaluation. Patients are asked how they're doing, but they're also, you know, assessed in terms of their rate of speech, their ability to show up at work. You know, there are all kinds of things that doctors look at or it may not be doctors, and maybe nurses or other people who administer these tests. But in fact, one of the criticisms of these studies is that often the doctor's assessment is more optimistic than the patient's. The patients may say they're not doing better, and the doctor will say, yeah, but how come, you know, a month ago you couldn't go to your job and now you're going every day? So that people can feel some residuum of depression when they're socially and behaviorally doing a lot better.
Someone asks, is there an evolutionary benefit to depression?
Well, you know, this is not my area, but yes, I mean, people are very interested in this question. So the starting point is times of scarcity. So say there is a problem with the food supply, maybe animals who retreat to the cave and spend less energy foraging are going to do better than those who keep banging their head against the wall. That said, I think that largely applies to sadness or, you know, some kind of loss of energy. But depression, as I say, is a stuck switch problem. What happens is that those probably beneficial aspects of the ability to be sad or discouraged become self-perpetuating in a way that has very little relationship to the environment. And I think, you know, the easiest patients to treat are ones where they have good social circumstances, good social supports, some occupational skills, marriage perhaps, good marriage. And when we give them antidepressants and psychotherapy, it's easier to move them forward because there are better environmental circumstances. But they are depressed. You can be depressed with lots of good things going on, and where going out and foraging would do you plenty of good.
I mean, I talk about this actually in my last book, The Power of Different. The link between disorder and genius is some of the sort of strengths, the wiring that is the flip side of some of these illnesses, depression,
Right.
where, for example, you know, most people have a somewhat rosier view of the world than perhaps is reality. People with depression might have a much more pessimistic view, or they might just have a more realistic view, actually, a more realistic view of what is occurring in their environment. And of course, many people with who suffered with depression, once they're, you know, treated, have a unique kind of empathy actually for others, and, you know, a sensitivity for others that people who have not gone through that do. But someone is asking about electroconvulsive therapy as a treatment for depression.
Well, it's another complicated question. It, you know, probably is in the acute term, electroconvulsive therapy is probably the single most effective treatment for really refractory depression, in the sense that people get better. And doctors are better at giving ECT than they used to be. There are memory problems. The ECT, as it was given many years ago, could be quite destructive to the brain. I think ECT as it's given now is, you know, effective while being much less destructive. ECT has its problems because it looks as if people who recover with it often need subsequent courses, sometimes longer courses. Often they have to be on antidepressants at the same time. So, you know, I think if nothing else worked and you were deeply depressed, you ought to want ECT, and you probably would be grateful, you know, if you had a typical result.
For people who have totally treatment resistant to medication depression or psychotic depression, who have, thoughts of suicide that's really intractable, can be an incredibly effective form of treatment. Yeah.
And by the way, that's, where ketamine really made its name. We haven't talked about psychotic depression, which is its own thing, but it is, as it sounds like, a combination of depression and delusionality. And ketamine was approaching ECT in efficacy in some of the studies. So, that might be a place where people go first today.
Is there any research that you can talk about on the genetics of depression?
Yes, and I haven't reviewed this just lately, but Against Depression has a lot of that. Ken Kendler, who was a classmate, a residency mate of mine, is one of the great researchers in Virginia on genetics. And, it looks to be, when you look at identical twin studies, sort of depression looks to be about 40% genetic. And some of what is non-genetic is not environmental in the sense that we think of, where that is having to do with abuse in childhood, financial losses, divorce, disappointments, and so on. But it may be things that are intrauterine. There are all kinds of sort of random biological things that are environmental in a certain sense, but they're not experiential in the ordinary way. So probably 40% genetic and some other percentage of things that are sort of very early in life or innate, but not environmental in the ordinary sense. That said, having a very bad childhood does predispose to depression.
Some people who have clinical depressive episodes throughout their lives, just better to stay on an antidepressant forever?
Right. I mean, that is the question. I mean, when Listening to Prozac was written, the idea was that if you had very dangerous depressions and you'd had 2 or 3 of them and you'd been suicidal, doctors ought to really keep you on medicine a lot longer. We have people on antidepressants now for 20 years who don't meet those criteria. They just feel better on the medicine, they feel less well off it, and we don't really know what we're doing there. You can't do sort of a double-blind study where you have someone off medication for 20 years and on medication for 20 years. No one is going to get a PhD in short order conducting that study. And it's just not possible to pigeonhole patients in that way, to constrain them. But yes, I'd like to say we've been lucky. The popular view is that long-term antidepressant use has been very destructive to people and has all kinds of side effects. But if you compare it with people who are on anti-epileptic drugs for long periods of time, other things that people use chronically, we've been fairly lucky in the negative effects of long-term antidepressant use. That said, in my own practice, I really did try periodically to get most patients off antidepressants to see if I could do it, just out of that general doctorally sense that it's not good to be on medicines forever. But we don't know that that's the case. And there were old studies of anti-schizophrenic drugs where patients who came off ended up on more total medicine in aggregate than patients who didn't come off, that once you got a little behind, it took a lot to catch up. So we don't really know. But
in that vein, a few
yeah.
people have written in asking about weight gain, sexual side effects, and things that we know can absolutely be a part of treatment with antidepressants.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's, especially as patients get older, there's decreased libido, decreased sexual performance in various ways, and weight gain, definitely possible. Not the worst offender in that way among psychiatric drugs, but they're patients who have a lot of trouble. And it will be interesting with these new, pro-satiety, anti-craving drugs, whether, that is a possible combination with long-term antidepressant use.
Mm-hmm. is it still true that bipolar treatment shouldn't include antidepressants?
Yes, this is a really interesting question, very controversial. I have colleagues I admire who say that's the case. There were some early studies that when you gave people who were bipolar antidepressants, either they didn't work as well, or they increased cyclicity. That is, they shortened the interval between the next episode, and the next episode of depression or mania. That second finding really hasn't held up that well. I think this is a sort of work with your doctor one. There are lots of people who are expert in treating bipolar disorder who use antidepressants in the mix, especially for the depressive component. And those depressions can be very hard to treat. And I think it's hard to imagine that somebody would not turn to them occasionally. That's again, I'm not sure I'm giving the most conventional answer, but that's my observation.
I mean, certainly gingerly and concernedly, and only with a mood stabilizer on board would.
Yeah, no, and you want to watch very carefully and have a good relationship with the patient, involve the family, get reports from other people. You don't want to throw someone into a manic episode.
We're getting toward the end of our time. We have one more question here I think we still have time for. Do you believe today there is less stigma and resistance to seek help for depression? And is this heavily skewed by demographics, especially against, I think they're referring to low-income groups?
Yes, I think there's less stigma. I think there's still plenty of stigma. And stigma is funny. Once you make something more medical, you make it less a weakness of will problem, but you may also make it something where, you don't want your child to marry someone with the problem. So it's sort of a mixed blessing with a medicalization, a partial medicalization of depression. But I think there's certainly less stigma than, when I started my practice. And I think there is a fair amount, at least, of medication use in people on, Medicaid. Whether there's good comprehensive treatment, no. What we started out talking about is certainly the case, that the odds that you will get a good, careful, sympathetic psychotherapy along with the medication are probably very low.
I think we have a long ways to go in terms of real access. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Kramer, for
Thank you,
joining
Gail.
us.
Terrific set
Really
of questions.
Fabulous conversation.
I feel like the questions could have just kept coming. Such a great discussion. Thank you both so much. It sounds like a lot has progressed over the past 30 years, but we're still looking forward to a lot of rich and exciting research coming out over the next 30 years to come. I'd like to thank everyone, especially Dr. Kramer and Dr. Saltz. Thank you so much for your time with us this evening. I do encourage everyone to please check out the re-release of Listening to Prozac, the book, and please check out our upcoming Spark Your Health events. We have great lineup for this coming fall, especially on September 22nd. We also have Atul Gawande in conversation with Kay Redfield Jameson. It will prove to be a timely discussion on the transformative power of psychology and psychotherapy. So if you liked this talk, you might like that as well. But thank you everyone so much, and stay well.